and about critique of the UN system. For the next minutes, Craig Mokhiber will be speaking. Mr. Mokhiber, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Good, we can hear you too, loud and clear. The time is yours.
Thank you very much, distinguished members of the Jury of Conscience, members of the Tribunal, ladies and gentlemen. Throughout the genocide, senior UN officials have adopted a kind of rhetorical shield that allows them to avoid taking a principled stand on the genocide in Palestine. Quote, only a court can determine a genocide, they say. But this is a calculated dodge because they fear a backlash from the perpetrator, from its powerful allies, and from abusive Israel proxy organizations. Only a court can decide, can be claimed about any crime, about which they never hesitate to comment. The same officials regularly invoke the word terrorism without the need for a judicial decision. Furthermore, the organization has obligations of genocide prevention, which is a logical impossibility after the crime has already occurred and a court has concluded its proceedings. This distinguished jury is the diplomacy of fear. And that has been the dominant response of the political corridors of the UN to the genocide in Palestine. But such moral abdication in the case of Palestine is not new at the UN. Indeed, the coincidence in 1948 of the adoption of both the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Genocide Convention, and the horror of the Nakba that same year, was more than just a historical contradiction. It was also the birth of a virus, the virus of the Israel exception to international law, that has haunted the organization for decades, buttressed Israeli impunity, carved out space for genocide, and eroded the very legitimacy and sustainability of the UN itself. Today, Palestine sits directly on the fault line between those who believe that the global order should be determined by deference to power, great power politics, aggression, colonialism, and imperialism, and those who demand the building of a reliable international system constructed on international cooperation, human rights, equality, self-determination, and the rule of international law. Indeed, the genocide in Palestine has revealed the tendency, hardwired into the system from the start, to compromise mandates and principles in deference to state power. But this genocide has also underscored that there are, in fact, two UNs. The first is the UN of the Charter norms, constitutionally grounded in a mission of human rights and peace and development and international law. This is the UN of the human rights treaties, of the independent UN human rights monitors, of the International Court of Justice. It is the UN in which the use of force is prohibited in all but a few narrowly defined circumstances. This is the UN of decolonization, the UN in which all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, and in which peoples have the right to self-determination. It is the right in which colonialism, apartheid, gross violations of human rights, and genocide are absolutely prohibited. The UN that once officially recognized that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. And it is the UN in which officials rang the genocide alarm bell as far back as October of 2023. But members of the jury, there is another darker UN, a UN that permitted the colonization of Palestine, partitioned the land against the will of the indigenous people, ratified the ethnic cleansing of Palestine by recognizing Israel in 1948, and tolerated decades of apartheid. It is the UN that suspended the application of international law for 3 decades in favor of a disingenuous political process called Oslo, under which the Palestinians were told that they, unprotected by international law, must negotiate for their rights with their oppressor, and that the mediator for the process would be the world's sole superpower and Israel's closest ally. And it is the UN that has remained almost entirely silent as genocide raged across the land, trepidatiously avoiding any reference to the crime or to its root causes. The UN that was unable even to order a ceasefire or to hold perpetrators accountable while they were openly committing genocide. This is the UN of moral failure. As the genocide in Palestine has shown, the veto power of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the only body with formal enforcement power, is the most obvious example of failure by design. That power has been used throughout the genocide by the US to prevent any meaningful act of protection for Palestinian civilians, enforcement of international law, or accountability for Israeli perpetrators. 6 successive vetoes have been exercised by the United States since October of 2023, bringing U.S. vetoes to protect Israeli impunity to a total of 50. No sanctions have been imposed by the Council on the perpetrator regime. No protection mobilized, no judicial decisions enforced, and the Israeli regime even remains a full member of the United Nations with full privileges, despite its perpetration of the ongoing genocide, its apartheid status, its denial of the self-determination of the Palestinian people, serial acts of aggression against its neighbors, unlawful occupation of the territory of 3 surrounding nations, a transnational terrorist attack with booby-trapped pagers, numerous assassinations, and frequent attacks on the United Nations itself, its staff and facilities. For its part, the General Assembly has adopted important resolutions to respond to the genocide in the face of a captured and moribund Security Council. And the Assembly has declared that all countries must comply with the detailed findings of the ICJ. It has adopted resolutions demanding a ceasefire, and most significantly adopted a resolution in September of 2024 endorsing the entirety of the findings of the International Court of Justice and its advisory opinion of 19 July 2024, as well as the provisional measures of the ICJ in Israeli genocide. And historically, it set a 1-year deadline for full Israeli compliance. But members of the jury, that deadline expired 5 weeks ago without any meaningful action. Instead, Israel's friends in the UN rallied to forestall any meaningful action for accountability and redress, instead to create a strategy of distraction by adopting the so-called French-Saudi proposal, now named the New York Declaration, which makes no mention of genocide or apartheid, diverts attention away from human rights accountability under international law and into a loose political process and the promise of a possible limited state at some point in the future. That would deploy a proxy occupation force, further denying Palestinian agency and self-determination, compel Palestinians once again to negotiate for their rights with their oppressor, and work to normalize the Israeli regime as it consolidates its conquest of Palestine. In sum, the true focus of these initiatives is not on saving Palestine, but rather on saving Israel and Zionism, even in the wake of a genocide. This is the UN of complicity. And as we speak today, Security Council diplomats are working to merge the lawless French-Saudi plan with Donald Trump's atrocious 20-point colonial dictate for Palestine in an attempt to legitimize it with the imprimatur of the UN Security Council. And so, on the UN's watch, Israeli impunity continues just as Palestinian subjugation continues. Even as the horror drags on and Israel shatters record after record for civilian bloodletting, the UNGA has yet to use the full range of powers at its disposal. It continues to recognize Israel's credentials, and the regime's voting rights remain intact. Even as it attacks and smears the organization, blocks its operations, raids and demolishes its installations, and abducts, detains, tortures, and murders its staff. The UNGA has yet to reactivate the UN's anti-apartheid mechanisms, has established no tribunal for accountability, has not moved to mandate a UN protection force to protect Palestinians from a genocidal regime bent on their destruction, even though it has the power to do so under the Uniting for Peace mechanism. And it has not solidified earlier calls for sanctions, a military embargo, and measures to isolate the Israeli regime and hold its officials to account. For its part, Switzerland, acting as depositary of the Fourth Geneva Convention, scandalously declined to convene the Conference of High Contracting Parties requested by the General Assembly, owing to objections from Israel, the US, and their allies, and despite the fact that it was requested by an overwhelming number of UN member states. And beyond intergovernmental bodies, the tendency to compromise UN principles in deference to power, especially that of the US and its Western allies, has also been evident in the positioning of the UN Secretary General and senior UN officials, where the Israel exception has been in plain view. Throughout the genocide, the UN's senior-most political leadership, including the Secretary General, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and even the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, have remained unable or unwilling to directly address the genocide or even to utter the word. Instead, taking refuge behind the safe language of armed conflict, the amorphous promise of a two-state solution someday, and the necessity of humanitarian aid. Adopting a kind of both-sidesism, which fails to recognize the true dynamics of colonizer and colonized, occupier and occupied, oppressor and oppressed, genocidaires, and victims. And barely a whisper has been heard about accountability for Israeli perpetrators. As such, the significant reserve of moral and political power of the senior-most podiums of the organization have been left largely untapped. Root causes, normally the first area of inquiry and conflict resolution, have been almost entirely ignored. The seizure of Palestine in 1948, its colonization, the theft of land and homes within the Green Line, the ethno-nationalist state, the violent supremacism of Zionism, the system of apartheid, systemic inequalities, official racism and dehumanization, the plight of generations of Palestinian refugees, and colonial domination, none of these have received any significant attention in the statements of the political leadership or in the succession of failed political processes launched since Oslo. Perhaps worse, the political offices operating under the direct authority of the Secretary General have not only largely ignored the genocide in Palestine, but in some cases, under external, mostly Western political pressure, and without exercising the most basic level of due diligence, have non-critically reinforced the Israeli regime's fabricated propaganda for genocide and its justifications for international crimes. Month after month, as the alarm bell raged and as many human rights monitors repeatedly warned of genocide, the Secretary General's special advisor on the prevention of genocide remained entirely silent on the carnage in Gaza, prompting petitions from UN staff and civil society calls for her firing. The Secretary General's special advisor on sexual violence in conflict, under an organized pressure campaign from the Israeli regime and its proxy organizations in the West, refused to debunk and at times reinforced Israel's fabricated accusations of a Hamas campaign of mass rape, and therefore contributed to the regime's false narratives designed to manufacture consent for genocide. And the Office of the Special Advisor on Children in Armed Conflict, under political pressure from and through the Secretary General, repeatedly censored its own annual listing of countries systematically violating the rights of children to remove Israel and ensure its continued impunity. This is the UN of failure. But distinguished members of jury, as I conclude, I want to leave you with 3 points of light in the international system. In sharp contrast to the historic failings of these intergovernmental bodies and the political offices of the Secretary General, the independent human rights mechanisms mandated by the Human Rights Council in Geneva have maintained a principled, law-based approach to their human rights monitoring and reporting duties. An especially important role has been played by the Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, who, in the face of a sustained campaign of harassment, smears, death threats, and slander campaigns by the governments of Israel, its allies and proxies, as well as official US sanctions, Rapporteur Francesca Albanese has been undeterred, producing a series of meticulously documented analytical reports on the genocide and on its colonial roots, maintaining a continuous visible media presence and close collaboration with Palestinian and global civil society. And several other thematic rapporteurs, as well as the UN Commission of Inquiry, have also worked diligently to defend the human rights of the people of Palestine and to build the case for Israeli accountability, despite efforts to discredit or silence them. The jury will note that throughout the genocide, the contrast between the principled, fact-based, law-centered, and accountability-focused approach of the special procedures on the one hand, and the equivocal, politicized, lawless, and trepidatious rhetoric of the Secretariat on the other, could not be starker. And of course, the International Court of Justice is also a part of the UN system. Thanks to the court, the Israeli regime is today on trial for genocide. The court has issued several rounds of provisional measures and historic advisory opinions finding apartheid and racial segregation, and has held that the occupation of Palestine is entirely unlawful. And just this week, it found the regime's obstruction of aid, attacks on UNRWA, and use of starvation as a method of war are breaches of international legal obligations. These pronouncements provide even more proof of the legitimacy of the Palestinian cause and the illegitimacy of Israel's project and crimes in Palestine. Finally, the UN also includes courageous humanitarian workers from a host of agencies, foremost among them the people of UNRWA, who to this day continue to operate in the depths of Gaza's hell to support the survivors of genocide, despite the smears of the Israeli regime and its collaborators in Washington and Europe, despite the bombs, the bullets, the widespread destruction, the targeting of UN facilities, the abduction and torture of countless UNRWA staff, and the murder of more than 370 of them, many along with their families. They represent the best of the United Nations system, they embody its highest principles, and they deserve our unwavering solidarity. I thank you.